Number 1. Myra Hindley. Most people in 1960s England thought evil had a face they would recognize, but no one imagined it would look like a quiet young woman with a blonde bouffant and a soft voice. Long before her name became synonymous with terror, Myra Hindley was seen as ordinary. She was born in 1942 in Manchester and grew up in a troubled working-class home shaped by strict discipline and emotional coldness. Neighbors described her as serious and guarded, someone who kept her real feelings buried. As a teenager, she lost a close friend in a tragic accident, and that loss deeply affected her. She tried to build a normal life, worked secretarial jobs, and blended in with the community. But everything changed the moment she met Ian Brady. They met at a chemical company in 1961. She was drawn in by his confidence, dark charm, and fascination with violence and authoritarian ideas. He gave her books about power, control, and criminal history. Hindley, who had always struggled to define herself, latched onto his worldview. Their relationship intensified quickly, and she began reshaping everything about herself to fit his influence. Her beliefs, her appearance, even her morals. While most saw a couple keeping to themselves, behind closed doors they were growing more detached from empathy. The crimes that followed would later be known as the Moors murders. Between 1963 and 1965, Brady and Hindley abducted and killed multiple children, targeting vulnerable young victims in the greater Manchester area. Hindley played an active role. She used her appearance to gain trust, lured victims to cars, and facilitated the attacks without hesitation. They buried the bodies on Saddleworth Moor, a bleak stretch of land that became permanently linked to their names. The murders sent fear through the region, but no one suspected the quiet couple living among them. The brutality was hidden behind friendly smiles and a normal home. Suspicion surfaced when a relative of Brady became uneasy about his behavior. In 1965, police arrested Brady after he attacked someone with an axe. During the investigation, evidence tied Hindley and Brady to missing children whose disappearances had gone unsolved. At first, Hindley denied everything, presenting herself as a loyal, frightened woman caught up in Brady's actions. But as investigators dug deeper, the truth began to surface. Items belonging to victims were found in her possession, and the couple's connection to the murders became undeniable. The discovery of audio recordings of one of the children being tortured further exposed her direct involvement. Their trial began in 1966 and quickly drew national attention. Brady was painted as the driving force, but Hindley's participation shocked the public even more. The idea that a woman could help orchestrate crimes against children defied expectations at the time and fueled national outrage. In court, she remained composed, often expressionless, and insisted she acted under Brady's control. The prosecution argued she was not a bystander, but an equal participant who showed no remorse. Witness testimony and forensic evidence left no room for doubt. She was convicted of murder and given a whole life tariff, meaning she would never be released. The public treated her as a symbol of corruption and betrayal of maternal instincts, and her name became one of the darkest in British criminal history. Over the years, Hindley attempted to reduce her sentence and reshape her image. She converted to Catholicism, claimed she had reformed, and argued that Brady manipulated her. Still, each time her case was raised, families of the victims and the wider public opposed any consideration of release. Politicians repeatedly stated that she should never be freed. As time went on, more details emerged about other victims who were not part of the original convictions. Searches of the moor continued long after the trial, and some remains were not found until decades later. Hindley occasionally cooperated with investigators, but many believed her willingness to assist was self-serving rather than sincere. Her life in prison remained marked by controversy, failed appeals, and intense media coverage. Each time her name appeared in the news, it reignited anger and grief. She died in prison in 2002 at the age of 60, still carrying the label of one of Britain's most hated criminals. Even after her death, her case remained a reference point in debates about sentencing, culpability, and the nature of evil. Hindley's actions reshaped how the public viewed female offenders, especially those who acted alongside a partner. People questioned whether she was controlled by Brady or whether she had fully embraced the violence herself. Most came to believe she made choices at every step and could have stopped, but chose not to. Her legacy is one of lasting pain for the families involved and a disruption of assumptions about who is capable of cruelty. The children whose lives were taken never had the chance to grow up, and their names are remembered far more compassionately than hers. The moorlands where the bodies were buried became a permanent symbol of the crimes, and even today, people associate that landscape with sorrow. Hindley's story shows how influence, desire, and moral surrender can combine into something catastrophic. The public never forgave her and never accepted any attempt at redemption. To most, her partnership with Brady didn't lessen her guilt. It proved how far she was willing to go when given the chance. Her case remains a chilling example of how someone who appeared reserved and controlled could participate in acts that stunned a nation. And while her death closed the legal chapter, the outrage surrounding her name never truly faded. People still debate whether she was shaped by her partner or revealed by him. What is certain is that her involvement left scars that generations won't forget. Up next is a woman whose crimes shocked North America in an entirely different way. Number 2, Karla Homolka. Before her name became one of the most hated in Canadian criminal history, Karla Homolka looked like the last person anyone would suspect of involvement in evil. Born in 1970 in Ontario, she grew up in a seemingly normal suburban family and was often described as friendly, responsible, and well-liked. She worked at a pet store and had a reputation for being polite and dependable. But beneath that surface was someone deeply impressionable and attracted to control and status. When she met Paul Bernardo in the late 1980s, everything shifted. He was charming, confident, and manipulative, and she was drawn to him instantly. Their relationship became intense and dark very quickly, with him dominating almost every part of her life. As their relationship progressed, Bernardo began escalating his fantasies and obsessions, and Homolka didn't pull away. She participated. In December 1990, the horror became real within her own home. Her teenage sister Tammy died after being assaulted while unconscious. Homolka later claimed it was an accident involving drugs and alcohol, but investigators would eventually uncover the truth. She had actively helped incapacitate Tammy so Bernardo could act on his desires. Instead of this event forcing her to stop, it marked the beginning of a pattern that continued into the following years. Homolka appeared calm at the funeral and carried on with life as though nothing had happened. Most of those around her had no idea what had occurred behind closed doors. The crimes that followed involved other young victims, lured and trapped by the couple's calculated planning. Homolka helped with every step, enticing victims, assisting in their captivity, and cooperating in acts that shocked even seasoned investigators. The crimes weren't random or impulsive. They were planned, filmed, and hidden with chilling attention to detail. Homolka often played the role of the approachable woman who helped lower the girl's defenses. What disturbed the public most later was how she presented herself during this time, holding a regular job, smiling in photos, attending family events, and maintaining the illusion of normalcy while knowing exactly what was happening. For a while, suspicion didn't fall on them, even though police were searching for a serial predator. Homolka and Bernardo continued living their double life, eventually getting married in 1991 in a large ceremony that appeared almost storybook from the outside. But behind the scenes, Their relationship was violently dysfunctional. Bernardo was abusive, and Homolka portrayed herself as his victim later on. Yet her behavior during the crimes didn't match someone acting out of fear alone. She actively participated, concealed evidence, and helped cover up what happened to the victims. The turning point came when Bernardo began targeting women in Scarborough, and police pressure intensified. In 1993, after a violent argument, Homolka left him and sought medical treatment for injuries. That visit triggered more questions, and her family began pushing her to separate from him. Around the same time, police linked Bernardo to multiple assaults through DNA evidence. With investigators closing in, Homolka faced the possibility of being charged alongside him. Rather than risk a full trial, she made a calculated decision that would define her legacy. She went to authorities claiming she had been abused and coerced, casting herself as another one of his victims. Prosecutors believed she held valuable information that could secure his conviction, and they agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Bernardo, she received a 12-year sentence for manslaughter. At the time, authorities did not yet have access to videotapes the couple had made during the crimes, evidence that showed she was not only compliant, but actively involved. Once those tapes were found, it was too late. The deal was locked in, and it sparked a wave of outrage across Canada. The public felt misled, and the term "deal with the devil" was used repeatedly in headlines and political debates. When Bernardo went to trial, Homolka took the stand and described the crimes in detail. Her testimony helped secure his convictions and life sentence. But while he would never leave prison, she faced just over a decade behind bars. Families of the victims and much of the Canadian public believed she had escaped true justice. The tapes showed she had opportunities to stop what was happening and chose not to. They showed her presence and participation were voluntary, not forced. From that moment on, she became a symbol of betrayal, not only to the victims, but to the justice system itself. Homolka served her time in Canadian prisons, spending part of it in a psychiatric facility. She was eventually released in 2005, despite widespread effort to block her return to public life. After her release, she changed her name, moved provinces, and later relocated outside Canada for periods of time. Each time her whereabouts were discovered, communities reacted with fear and anger. She married, had children, and tried to avoid media attention, but her past followed her everywhere. Even minor sightings triggered national news coverage and renewed debate over whether her sentence was fair. To this day, opinions about her remain divided only in degree. Most see her as someone who got far less punishment than her actions warranted. Her role shattered assumptions about complicity and female involvement in violent crime. The controversy over her plea deal reshaped Canadian legal policy, with prosecutors becoming far more cautious about agreements in serious cases. Even decades later, her name still surfaces whenever discussions arise about sentencing, rehabilitation, and the limits of legal negotiation. Her story is a disturbing example of choice over coercion, of what can happen when someone aligns themselves completely with another person's darkness. And even though she walked out of prison, the court of public opinion never released her. The next case is about a woman whose obsession led to a single murder that shocked America and ended with a life sentence. Number 3. Jodi Arias. When police first entered the Arizona home of Travis Alexander in June 2008, they were met with a scene that felt impossible to reconcile with the image of the woman who would later be arrested. Jodi Arias didn't look like someone capable of extreme violence. She was soft-spoken, artistic, and outwardly calm. Before her name filled headlines, she grew up in California in what appeared to be a typical family. She worked small jobs, explored photography, and drifted through relationships without drawing attention. Nothing in her early life hinted at the storm that would eventually make her one of the most talked about defendants in American crime history. She met Travis Alexander at a work conference in 2006 through a marketing company. He was charismatic, social, and active in his church, and she was instantly drawn to his personality. Their connection was fast, intense, and complicated. They began a long-distance relationship that mixed affection, jealousy, and emotional dependency. Friends and family on his side noticed red flags early. Arias became possessive and unpredictable when she felt ignored. She moved to Arizona to be closer to him, then later relocated to California, but still maintained constant contact. Even after their relationship officially ended, she continued inserting herself into his life, sometimes showing up unannounced. In the weeks leading up to his death, friends of Travis said he seemed conflicted. He wanted to move on, but Arias wouldn't let go. He was planning a trip to Mexico with another woman, something Jodi found out about shortly before everything unraveled. On June 4th, 2008, Travis missed important calls and appointments. Nearly a week passed before friends went to his home to check on him. What they found was horrifying. His body was discovered in the bathroom with multiple injuries, and the scene showed signs of a violent struggle. The brutality stunned investigators and the public alike. It was clear this wasn't random. It was personal. Suspicion quickly turned toward Arias. She had spoken to police early on and claimed she hadn't seen him in weeks. Detectives found her behavior odd. She offered details no one asked for, cried at strange moments, and volunteered unprompted explanations. As they dug into phone records, travel routes, gas receipts, and timestamps, an unsettling picture formed. Her car had been rented, her hair color changed, and she had taken an unusual road trip that placed her near his home around the time of his death. Evidence piled up fast. The biggest break came when police found a damaged camera in the washing machine at the crime scene. They recovered photos that showed both Arias and Alexander together on the day he died, and additional images taken during and after the attack. Once confronted with undeniable evidence, her story began to shift. First, she claimed she hadn't been there. Then she suggested two intruders were responsible. Eventually, she said she killed him in self-defense. Each explanation contradicted earlier statements, and prosecutors argued she was trying to control the narrative rather than tell the truth. The trial that followed in 2013 became a national spectacle. Cameras in the courtroom, intense media coverage, and the defendant's demeanor turned it into one of the most widely followed criminal cases of the decade. During testimony, Arias spoke calmly and at length, describing her version of events. But the prosecution focused on the forensic evidence, the staged cover-up, and the planning that suggested this was not spontaneous. The jury heard about her jealousy, possessiveness, and repeated attempts to contact Travis even after he tried to distance himself. They also examined physical details that showed he had tried to defend himself. Jurors were shown time-stamped photos that left no room for alternative explanations. The prosecution argued she acted out of anger and fear of abandonment, not self-defense. The verdict was clear. She was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase stretched on with dramatic courtroom exchanges and debates over whether she should receive the death penalty. Some jurors supported that outcome, but they couldn't reach a unanimous decision. Ultimately, the judge imposed life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many observers, the focus wasn't just the crime itself, but the way Arias tried to manipulate perception from the very beginning. Even after conviction, she gave interviews, made statements, and continued to attract public fascination. Today, she remains incarcerated in Arizona, serving a life sentence. She has no chance of release, and her name still sparks debate about motive, deception, and obsession. The case became a reference point in discussions about intimate partner violence, not from the side usually expected. Many people who followed the story still talk about how she presented herself compared to what she did. There was no history of violent crime, no long criminal record, no outward signal of what was coming. The contrast between the image she projected and the reality of the crime keeps her story alive in documentaries, podcasts, and legal discussions. What continues to unsettle people is how calculated everything appeared afterward. She tried to call his phone, left voicemails, and sent messages as if nothing had happened. She even reached out to the woman he planned to travel with. Her behavior was not that of someone shocked or panicked. It was someone covering tracks. The contrast is part of why the case drew so much attention. Unlike other high-profile murders, this one centered on a single victim and a single perpetrator whose motivation stemmed from a personal relationship spiraling out of control. Even years later, the public hasn't fully moved on. Some see her as manipulative and dangerous. Others analyze the psychological factors that led to the killing. The one thing everyone agrees on is that the evidence left no doubt about her responsibility. And despite all the shifting stories, the court's judgment ensured she will never walk free. Next is a case where belief and delusion collided, leading to crimes that horrified an entire nation. Number 4, Lori Vallow Daybell. Long before her name was linked to death, missing children, and a doomsday prophecy, Lori Vallow was seen as a devoted mother with a bright smile and a seemingly ordinary life. Born in 1973 in California, she grew up in a religious household and married young. Over the years, she went through multiple marriages, each ending with growing instability. She had 3 children and often presented herself as spiritual, loving, and strong. To those who knew her casually, she didn't seem dangerous, just someone searching for purpose. But her beliefs would eventually drift far beyond anything recognizable, pulling her into a world where visions, prophecy, and apocalyptic promises overshadowed reality. In 2018, everything changed when she met Chad Daybell, a religious author in Idaho whose books focused on end-times theology. He believed he was chosen to help lead the 144,000 who would survive the end of the world. Lori connected instantly with his ideas. She began telling friends she had lived multiple past lives, that dark spirits could possess people, and that some individuals were already dead spiritually, even if their bodies were alive. Her behavior shifted dramatically. She told others that the world would end soon and that she had a special mission. This new identity pushed her further away from her family and closer to conspiracy and control. Her 2 youngest children, 7-year-old J.J. Vallow and 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, disappeared in 2019. Lori never reported them missing. Instead, she told people different stories. Tylee was at college. JJ was with a friend. Everything was fine. Family members kept asking questions, especially JJ's grandparents, who contacted authorities after Lori cut off communication. When police in Rexburg, Idaho, tried to conduct a welfare check, Lori claimed JJ was in Arizona. Investigators quickly learned that wasn't true. Days later, Lori and Chad left the state and refused to cooperate. The search for the children gained national attention, and every unanswered question made things look worse. As authorities dug into Lori's history, a disturbing pattern emerged. People connected to her kept dying. Her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, just months before the children vanished. Lori told police it was self-defense, and she showed little emotion after his death. Not long afterward, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, died unexpectedly in what was initially labeled natural causes. Within weeks, Lori and Chad were married on a beach in Hawaii. While they enjoyed their honeymoon, investigators were building a case and tracking growing inconsistencies. By early 2020, Lori was ordered by a court to produce the children. She ignored the demand and was arrested in Hawaii for failing to comply. Chad stayed silent and avoided the press. Meanwhile, Investigators continued searching the Daybell property in Idaho. In June 2020, they found human remains buried in the backyard. The remains were confirmed to be JJ and Tylee. The condition and placement of the bodies revealed the level of planning that went into hiding them. The discovery ended months of hope for surviving family members and confirmed what many had feared. Public reaction was immediate and furious. Lori's earlier claims about being a chosen leader and her calm reaction to the children's disappearance made the case even more unsettling. Prosecutors charged both Lori and Chad with murder, conspiracy, and related crimes, including the death of Tammy Daybell. During court hearings, Lori often appeared detached, sometimes smiling or whispering to her attorneys. She continued to talk about spiritual battles, alternate identities, and dark spirits influencing people. Her defense tried to argue mental health issues, but the prosecution focused on evidence showing intent and planning. The trial in 2023 laid out the timeline of manipulation, deception, and murder. Witnesses testified about her growing extremism, her fascination with doomsday roles, and how she labeled loved ones as zombies before they disappeared or died. Investigators introduced phone records, digital messages, financial documents, and testimony from former friends who said Lori believed the children were obstacles to her spiritual destiny. The prosecution argued she wanted freedom from responsibility and a future with Chad without her children or his wife in the way. The jury convicted her of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, including the killings of JJ and Tylee and the plot involving Tammy Daybell's death. At sentencing, family members spoke about the pain, betrayal, and loss the crimes caused. The judge called Lori's actions heinous and selfish beyond measure. She received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The court made it clear she would never be released. Even after the conviction, she maintained that everything would make sense in a spiritual context. Chad Daybell is still awaiting trial, facing many of the same charges. The case continues to raise questions about influence, belief, and how far someone will go when convinced they are chosen or above consequence. Many people who once saw Lori as harmless now see a woman who combined fantasy, manipulation, and lethal intent. Today, she sits in an Idaho prison with no hope of freedom. The story of Lori Vallow Daybell shows how delusion wrapped in religious overtones can mask violent choices. Her children vanished, and instead of panic, she planned her wedding and fled the state. The contrast between her public calm and the horror discovered in that backyard still stuns those who followed the case. Next is a woman whose crimes on the road turned into one of the most infamous murder cases in Florida history. Number 5. Aileen Wuornos. Long before she became a headline, Aileen Wuornos was a child drifting through a life already stacked against her. Born in 1956 in Michigan, she never knew a stable home. Her father was imprisoned and later died, and her mother abandoned her while she was still a toddler. She and her brother were sent to live with grandparents who struggled with alcoholism and violence. By her early teens, she was sleeping in cars, woods, and abandoned buildings. She survived by trading favors for food and shelter, and every year pushed her further away from anything resembling normal life. What followed was a pattern of pain, survival, and conflict that shaped how she saw the world. By the late 1970s, she had made her way to Florida, drifting along highways and living off what she could get. She hitchhiked, stayed in cheap motels, and survived through theft, scams, and relationships that rarely lasted. Her criminal record started small: disorderly conduct, illegal possession, firing a gun from a moving vehicle, but each incident hinted at deeper instability. Those who met her described her as angry, volatile, and unpredictable, yet also desperate for connection. She formed a relationship with a woman named Tyria Moore, and the two lived together on the edge of poverty. Moore worked occasional jobs while Wuornos supported them through prostitution along Florida highways. Everything changed in late 1989 when a man named Richard Mallory was found dead in a remote area. He had been shot multiple times. At first, investigators had no clear suspect or motive, but over the next year, bodies of other men were discovered in similar circumstances: abandoned vehicles, remote locations, and gunshot wounds. The victims were middle-aged men, some traveling for work, others passing through the state. Detectives began connecting the cases. Witnesses reported seeing a blonde woman with some of the victims before they disappeared, and pawn shops traced items belonging to the men back to Wuornos. She was arrested in January 1991 at a biker bar in Volusia County. Police found Moore and convinced her to speak with them. In exchange for avoiding charges, Moore agreed to call Wuornos and record their conversations. On tape, Aileen took responsibility for the shootings, but claimed she acted in self-defense. She insisted the men had attacked or threatened her and that she had no choice. However, the evidence and patterns suggested something else. Prosecutors described a cycle of robbery and murder driven by anger and desperation, not survival from a sudden threat. Her trial in 1992 drew enormous media attention. She sat in court with a hardened expression, often appearing detached from the proceedings. The prosecution built a case around the consistency of the crimes: the similar injuries, the locations, the stolen property, and her efforts to disguise her identity. They emphasized that none of the victims were reported as violent offenders and that Wuornos never contacted authorities after any of the alleged incidents. Her own statements shifted over time. Sometimes it was self-defense. Other times she claimed the men deserved it for what they represented. She was convicted of the murder of Richard Mallory and eventually charged in several of the other deaths. The court sentenced her to death. Over the next decade, she remained on death row at the Florida Women's Reception Center. During that time, her mental state appeared to deteriorate. She spoke publicly in interviews, often contradicting herself and expressing distrust of nearly everyone around her. Some people who followed the case saw her as a product of extreme trauma. Others viewed her as fully responsible for the choices she made. Her anger toward the justice system grew, and at times she claimed she wanted the sentence carried out without appeals. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. She was 46 years old. Her death marked the end of one of the most widely publicized criminal cases involving a female offender in American history. Over time, her story became the subject of documentaries, books, and films. Some focused on her crimes, others on how her early life may have shaped her. She remains one of the few women labeled a serial killer in the United States, and her case is still discussed in legal and psychological contexts. What unsettles many about her story is the combination of relentless hardship and relentless violence. She lived on the margins for decades, and when she began killing, she targeted strangers who crossed her path at random. The contrast between the girl abandoned as a child and the woman condemned as a killer kept her case in the spotlight long after the verdict. Even in her final days, she remained defiant, blaming society and the legal system for what she had become. Her legacy is not one of mystery, but of collision, where trauma, anger, and opportunity met on the side of the road. The question of whether she was shaped by her past or driven by her own choices still sparks debate. But the courts left no doubt about her fate, and her death sentence marked the conclusion of a life that began in chaos and ended in infamy. Next is a woman whose crimes targeted society's most vulnerable and left investigators stunned by what they uncovered. Number 6. Juana Barraza. Long before headlines labeled her one of Mexico's most infamous serial killers, Juana Barraza was a woman shaped by hardship from the very beginning. Born in 1957 in rural Hidalgo, She grew up in poverty with little stability or protection. Her mother was an alcoholic who, according to later testimony, traded her to an older man when she was still a child. That betrayal set the stage for a life marked by trauma, distrust, and anger. With no real education, she moved between low-paying jobs and did whatever she could to survive, carrying years of resentment toward older women who reminded her of her mother. In her 20s and 30s, she found an outlet in an unusual place, professional wrestling. Under the ring name La Dama del Silencio, or the Lady of Silence, she performed in small arenas around Mexico City. She wore flashy outfits and a mask, playing the part of a strong, quiet fighter. Wrestling gave her a persona that felt powerful, controlled, and respected, something she lacked in everyday life. Outside the ring, she had children and tried to maintain a household, but financial struggles never went away. The cost of supporting her family on inconsistent income constantly pushed her to the edge. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, reports of murdered elderly women began to alarm authorities in Mexico City. These victims were found in their homes, often alone, and living on modest pensions. They were attacked without forced entry, suggesting the killer gained their trust or found a convincing way inside. The press began calling the perpetrator La Mata Viejitas, the little old lady killer. At first, police didn't believe a woman could be responsible. They profiled the suspect as a man disguised as a woman or working with female accomplices. That assumption allowed the crimes to continue longer than they might have otherwise. Juana Barraza targeted women who were typically in their 70s or 80s. She would enter their homes by pretending to be a nurse, social worker, or government employee offering benefits. Once inside, she acted quickly, attacking them and leaving their bodies behind. Investigators later said she seemed to follow a pattern driven by rage rather than theft, even though she sometimes took items afterward. Witnesses who saw a strong, broad-shouldered woman near crime scenes were dismissed or ignored because the idea of a female serial killer seemed unlikely. As the number of victims rose, public fear grew. Elderly women, often already isolated, lived with the fear that someone might knock on their door pretending to help. The authorities struggled to connect the cases at first, and mistakes during the investigation led to false arrests and public criticism. Only after forensic evidence and witness accounts aligned did police begin to consider that the killer could, in fact, be a woman with physical strength. In January 2006, everything changed when a witness saw a middle-aged woman leaving the home of her latest victim, an 82-year-old named Ana Maria de los Reyes. Police were called immediately and apprehended Juana Barraza nearby. Inside her bag, they found items that tied her directly to the murder. When investigators searched her home, they discovered objects linked to other victims and documents connected to the false identities she used to approach them. DNA evidence further tied her to multiple scenes. During questioning, Barraza admitted to some of the killings but denied others. She said she acted out of anger, triggered by her past and the memory of her mother. Her legal team attempted to argue mental and emotional impairment, but prosecutors moved forward with charges tied to numerous deaths. In 2008, she was convicted of 16 counts, including murder and robbery, though she was suspected in dozens more. The court sentenced her to 759 years in prison, effectively ensuring she would die behind bars. The public reaction was a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. The idea that an ex-wrestler and mother had quietly become a serial killer challenged assumptions about gender and violence. Many pointed out that authorities had wasted valuable time by refusing to consider a woman as a suspect. Others focused on the fact that her victims were among society's most vulnerable and least protected. Elderly women trusted her because she looked like someone offering help, not harm. Today, Juana Barraza is held at the Santa Marta Acatitla Women's Prison in Mexico City. she is not eligible for release. Her case has been studied by criminologists and psychologists who examine the connection between lifelong trauma and violent behavior. She rarely speaks to the media, but when she has, she shows little remorse. She has become a symbol of how anger and neglect can evolve into something deadly when left unchecked. What sets her apart is not just the number of victims, but the deliberate way she exploited kindness and loneliness. Unlike others who killed partners or acquaintances, she sought out strangers who trusted her. Her crimes forced Mexico to confront the possibility that serial killers are not always male, and danger can come from those who appear familiar. Her name still lingers in conversations about criminal profiling and victim protection. Even years later, people remember how long she eluded capture and how many warnings were missed. The shock didn't come only from what she did, but from who she was and how easily she moved through neighborhoods unnoticed. Next is a woman whose crimes targeted the youngest and most defenseless, leaving a trail of fear across Florida. Number 7. Christine Falling. Long before anyone suspected she was capable of taking a life, Christine Falling was a teenager in rural Florida who grew up surrounded by instability, illness, and neglect. Born in 1963 in Perry, Florida, she came from a home marked by poverty and hardship. From a young age, she struggled with developmental delays, medical problems, and a lack of consistent care. Teachers described her as slow, distracted, and unable to keep up with classmates. She dropped out of school early and rarely stayed in one place for long. Neighbors later said there were signs something was off, but no one imagined the extent of what she would eventually do. By her teens, she began working as a babysitter and caregiver for young children. Parents who hired her often did so out of necessity. Small towns didn't offer many options, and she seemed quiet, harmless, and willing to work for little pay. But as she moved between jobs, a disturbing pattern followed. Infants and toddlers in her care began dying under strange circumstances. At first, each death was explained away as sudden illness, seizures, or crib accidents. Doctors struggled to find definitive causes, and in some cases, didn't suspect foul play at all. She was rarely questioned, and no one connected the deaths to the same person. Between 1980 and 1982, several children she watched died unexpectedly. Each time she was present. Each time she gave vague explanations. Breathing problems, sudden collapses, mysterious choking. Because most of the victims were very young, authorities didn't immediately investigate her. One child, just a few months old, was found unresponsive not long after Falling claimed the infant had been crying and then went limp. Another toddler died after Christine reported that the child had suddenly stopped breathing. These accidents were spread across different households, allowing her to move on before suspicion settled in. The turning point came when a young girl named Cassie, who was older than most of the other victims, died after being left in Falling's care. At just under 5 years old, she collapsed shortly after Christine claimed she had gone to lie down. This time, doctors were less convinced by the explanations. An autopsy revealed signs of suffocation rather than illness. Investigators began reviewing Christine's past and found that multiple children had died shortly after being left alone with her. It was no longer coincidence. There was a pattern of unexplained deaths that followed her from home to home. When questioned by police, she at first denied responsibility, but soon began to change her story. Eventually, she confessed to killing several children by smothering them with her hands, using pillows, or covering their faces. She claimed she just felt the urge and that something inside her snapped. Later, she told authorities that voices in her head urged her to do it. Her confessions were chilling, delivered without emotion, and confirmed what investigators feared. In 1982, she was charged with multiple counts of murder. Prosecutors focused on 3 confirmed cases, but suspected she was responsible for more deaths that had gone unnoticed or uninvestigated. Rather than go to trial, she accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and received life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At the time, she was only 19 years old. Public reaction was a mix of anger and disbelief. The idea that a teenage babysitter could kill multiple children without anyone suspecting her for so long shocked communities across Florida. Families who once trusted her were left devastated, and some struggled with guilt for not seeing warning signs. Authorities were criticized for not recognizing the pattern sooner, especially as one child after another died while in her care. Her case highlighted serious gaps in oversight, especially for informal childcare arrangements. There were no background checks, no reporting requirements, and few medical reviews of unexplained child deaths in that era. Many people realized too late that she had been able to move freely from family to family without any suspicion following her. Some experts later argued that she exhibited signs of a rare type of serial killer driven not by money or revenge, but by impulse, frustration, or emotional disturbance. Christine Falling has been incarcerated at the Florida Women's Reception Center since the early 1980s. She has never been released. Over the years, she has occasionally sought parole, but those requests were denied due to the gravity of her crimes and opposition from the public and law enforcement. Even decades later, the details of her confessions and the ages of her victims keep her name tied to one of Florida's darkest childcare cases. Today, she remains a reminder that danger does not always come from strangers or obvious threats. She was someone families trusted with their most vulnerable children, and that trust was tragically misplaced. Whether driven by rage, mental illness, or a desire for control, she took lives she was meant to protect. The ripple effects of her actions still linger among families who lost children without answers for years. The quiet way she entered homes and the silent way her victims died left investigators stunned when the truth finally emerged. And even now, people who hear her story struggle to understand how she went unnoticed for so long. Next is a woman who built a different kind of deception, one that ended not just in murder, but in an execution. Number 8. Judy Buenoano. Long before she became known as one of America's most calculating female killers, Judy Buenoano lived a life that seemed marked by hardship, reinvention, and secrecy. Born as Judius Welty in Texas in 1943, she faced early turmoil when her mother died, and she was sent to live with her father and stepmother. She later claimed she was abused in that home, and by her teens, she had left to take control of her own life. She changed her name more than once, and often crafted new stories about her past, presenting herself in ways that made others trust her without question. Beneath that composed exterior, she carried ambitions and motives that would turn deadly. In the early 1970s, she was living in Florida with her husband, James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant. By all outward appearances, their life was stable. But in 1971, James suddenly fell gravely ill after returning from deployment. Doctors couldn't explain the rapid decline in his health, and within months, he died. Shortly after his death, Judy collected life insurance policies taken out in his name. At the time, no one raised suspicion, and she quietly moved forward with her life. Not long after, she became involved with another man, Bobby Joe Morris in Colorado. He also died under unexplained medical circumstances in 1978. Once again, Judy benefited financially and left the state without drawing attention. Around this time, people who knew her said she appeared calm and practical, never behaving like someone grieving. She returned to Florida with her children and continued presenting herself as a responsible single mother. What followed revealed just how far she was willing to go. In 1979, her teenage son, Michael, a healthy young man with plans for the future, suddenly developed severe and unexplained symptoms. His muscles weakened to the point he needed metal braces to walk. That same year, Judy took out a hefty life insurance policy on him. In 1980, she took Michael on a canoe trip on the East River near Pensacola. The canoe capsized, and Michael, unable to swim with his leg braces, drowned. Authorities initially viewed it as a tragic accident. Judy collected the insurance payout and continued life without interruption. Her pattern might have continued undetected if not for what happened next. In 1983, she became engaged to a Pensacola businessman named John Gentry. Without his knowledge, she encouraged him to take health supplements she prepared herself. He soon began experiencing violent sickness and sought medical help. Doctors couldn't identify the source of his condition, but he began to recover after stopping the pills. Unaware of the danger he'd narrowly escaped, he planned a future with her. But before their wedding, Judy attempted something far more drastic. She purchased a car insurance policy on him and arranged for him to pick up some items from his vehicle. As he started the engine, it exploded. Gentry miraculously survived the car bombing and was rushed to the hospital. Investigators initially believed it was a freak mechanical incident, but when detectives interviewed him, he mentioned the strange vitamins Judy had made him take and how his health had only worsened after meeting her. That information triggered a full investigation. Detectives re-examined Michael's drowning and found it suspicious in light of Gentry's near death. They exhumed the bodies of James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris. Toxicology tests revealed arsenic poisoning in both men, something that hadn't been detected earlier. Prosecutors concluded that Judy had systematically poisoned her victims, waited for symptoms to worsen, then benefited from their deaths. By 1984, she was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the murder of her son and attempted murder of Gentry. The evidence against her was overwhelming. During the trials, prosecutors described her as cold, methodical, and motivated by financial gain. Witnesses testified about insurance policies she had taken out shortly before each death and about her calm demeanor when tragedy struck. In court, she showed little emotion, which only deepened the public's reaction to her actions. She was convicted of first-degree murder in Michael's death and sentenced to life in prison. Then, in a separate trial for the attempted murder of Gentry and the poisoning of her husband, she was sentenced to death. The combination of poisoning, calculated planning, and financial motivation made her one of the rare female death row inmates in the United States. Judy Buenoano was executed by electric chair in Florida on March 30th, 1998. At the time, she was the first woman executed in the state since 1848 and the third woman executed in the U.S. since the reinstatement of the death penalty in the 1970s. She declined a final statement, maintaining her silence until the end. Her case continues to stand out because of the mix of deception and patience she used. Rather than acting impulsively, she waited weeks and months for poison to take effect, all while pretending to care for the very people she was harming. She manipulated trust, exploited relationships, and used insurance policies as incentives for murder. The fact that her victims included husbands, lovers, and even her own son left the public with a sense of disbelief that never fully faded. Even today, investigators and criminologists reference her case when discussing female offenders, profiling differences in motive and method, and the difficulty authorities once had detecting deliberate poisoning. She remains one of the most notorious examples of hidden violence carried out over years by someone who appeared entirely ordinary. Next is a woman whose crimes stretched across generations and claimed the lives of those closest to her. Number 9. Nannie Doss. Long before newspapers nicknamed her the Giggling Granny, Nannie Doss lived a life that gave no obvious warning of what she would later become. Born in 1905 in Alabama as Nannie Hazel, she grew up on a farm in a strict, isolated household. Her father controlled every aspect of the family's life. Schooling was limited, Work was constant, and independence was discouraged. As a child, she suffered a head injury in a train accident, something she later claimed left lasting effects. She developed an obsession with romance magazines and fantasized about love, marriage, and escape. But instead of escape, each step of her life drew her into a pattern of death that followed her for decades. At just 16, she entered her first marriage to a man named Charlie Braggs. The marriage was strained from the start. They had 4 children together, but their relationship was plagued by jealousy, abuse, and infidelity. Relatives who lived with them began dying mysteriously. 2 of their children died suddenly under unclear circumstances. At the time, doctors thought it might be food poisoning, and no investigation followed. Braggs later said he suspected Nannie but claimed he had no way to prove it. He eventually fled the home with their oldest child, leaving her with the youngest. After their divorce in the mid-1920s, Nannie moved quickly into more relationships. She married a man named Frank Harrelson in 1929. He was an alcoholic, and the relationship deteriorated over time. In 1945, he died after drinking whiskey laced with rat poison. Nannie later admitted she killed him because she was tired of his drinking and abuse. Rather than lying low, she continued seeking new husbands, always through personal ads or Lonely Hearts columns. Her third marriage was to a man named Arlie Lanning in North Carolina. Within 2 years, he died suddenly, supposedly from heart failure. After his death, the house they lived in conveniently burned down, and Nannie collected the insurance. His mother died shortly after while under Nannie's care. Once again, no suspicion fell on her. She then moved in with her sister, who also died unexpectedly, not long after Nannie arrived. It seemed that anyone who became close to her, husbands, relatives, even her own children, risked ending up buried without answers. But the pattern was still not recognized publicly, partly because she moved frequently and authorities in different states didn't share records the way they do now. In 1952, she married her 4th husband, Richard Morton, in Kansas. He died within a year after showing sudden symptoms similar to her previous partners. Nannie later admitted she poisoned him after discovering he had been unfaithful. By then, she was in her late 40s and had grown confident in her methods and her ability to hide behind charm and a pleasant appearance. Her final marriage was to a man named Samuel Doss in Oklahoma. He was a clean-living churchgoer who insisted on a proper lifestyle. Unlike her other husbands, he tried to limit her magazine subscriptions and spending habits. Only a few months into the marriage, he fell critically ill with stomach pains, recovered briefly, then collapsed again after returning home from the hospital. He died soon afterward. This time, doctors became suspicious. They ordered an autopsy, which revealed arsenic in his system. Police questioned Nannie, and the investigation quickly unraveled years of secrets. Bodies of former husbands and relatives were exhumed. Autopsies showed poison in multiple victims. Faced with mounting evidence, she confessed without much resistance. What made her case even more unsettling was the way she behaved during questioning. She smiled, laughed lightly, and described her actions without remorse. That demeanor led the press to call her the giggling granny, the jolly black widow, and the lonely hearts killer. She admitted to poisoning 4 husbands, her mother, one of her sisters, 2 of her children, and a grandson. Some believe the number may have been even higher, but not all deaths were conclusively tied to her. In 1955, she was convicted of murdering Samuel Doss. Rather than pursue charges for every death, prosecutors focused on that case to secure a life sentence. She avoided the death penalty and was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She remained there until her death in 1965 from leukemia. Even after her convictions, people struggled to understand how she moved undetected for nearly 30 years. Unlike many serial killers, she didn't hide in the shadows. She lived openly with relatives, attended church, read magazines, and portrayed herself as a loving wife. Her victims trusted her, and authorities at the time rarely suspected women of calculated, repeated murder using poison. Her story stands out because of how ordinary she appeared and how long she got away with it. Each death was explained as illness, bad luck, or heart problems. She didn't act impulsively. She planned, poisoned, waited, and collected insurance or freedom. Even her confessions lacked emotion, as though she were recounting chores rather than lives taken. To this day, Nannie Doss is remembered as someone who hid behind smiles and domestic roles while quietly ending the lives of those closest to her. She never showed regret, never asked for forgiveness, and never offered real explanations beyond mild irritation or personal convenience. Her legacy is a chilling reminder that evil can disguise itself behind familiarity and charm. The final case in this list involves a mother whose crime shocked the nation and sparked one of the most emotional trials of the 1990s. Number 10, Susan Smith. On the evening of October 25, 1994, a calm voice called 911 from Union, South Carolina. Susan Smith told the dispatcher that a black man had stolen her car at a red light and driven off with her 2 young sons still strapped inside. She said she had begged him to stop, that she chased the vehicle as it sped away, and that she didn't know where he was taking them. Within hours, the story drew national attention. Police set up roadblocks, search teams dragged lakes and fields, and news stations broadcast her tearful pleas to the country. She stood in front of cameras, begging the alleged kidnapper to bring back 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. The image of a devastated young mother holding back sobs shaped public sympathy instantly. But from the very beginning, parts of her story didn't sit right with investigators. There were no witnesses at the intersection. There were no tire tracks suggesting a sudden carjacking. Her timeline shifted slightly each time she was asked about it. Police tried to support her, holding press conferences, sending out alerts, even bringing in the FBI, but detectives quietly began doubting every detail. As days passed with no suspect and no sightings, the pressure on Susan grew. She repeated the abduction story on national television, her voice cracking as she begged for her boy's return. But behind the scenes, investigators were narrowing in on her. 9 days after the alleged carjacking, everything changed. On November 3rd, 1994, Susan finally broke. In a written confession, she admitted there had been no carjacker at all. She had driven her Mazda protege to John D. Long Lake. Her sons were strapped in their car seats in the back. She got out, released the handbrake, and let the car roll forward into the water. The vehicle drifted slowly before submerging fully. Unable to escape, Michael and Alex drowned as the car sank. Susan watched the water swallow the vehicle before walking away and later pretending to be the victim of a stranger's crime. When authorities pulled the car from the lake, the horror became real. Rescue workers found the boys exactly as she described, still buckled in their seats. The nation that had prayed for their safe return now turned on her in disbelief and outrage. Investigators revealed the motive they pieced together. Susan had been involved with a man who didn't want children in the picture, and she believed removing them would help her keep the relationship. She was also overwhelmed by personal stress, financial struggles, depression, and a recent separation from the boy's father. None of it explained or excused her decision, but it showed how far she had spiraled before making that irreversible choice. Her trial began in July 1995 and drew massive national coverage. The prosecution argued that she acted deliberately and chose her own future over her children's lives. They emphasized the planning, the lies, and the calculated attempt to blame an innocent man. The defense pointed to her mental state, childhood trauma, and claims of sexual abuse by her stepfather. Psychologists testified that she struggled with depression and suicidal thoughts, and that she might have acted in a moment of emotional collapse rather than pure malice. But the jury had to weigh those claims against the fact that she not only killed the children, but lied for over a week as the country searched for them. She was convicted of 2 counts of murder. The prosecution asked for the death penalty, but the jury chose life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The judge told her bluntly that she was receiving mercy she hadn't given her sons. Her sentence meant she would first be eligible for parole in 2024. She has remained in the South Carolina Department of Corrections ever since, spending most of her time out of the public eye. Even decades later, her case stands out not just for the crime itself, but for the deception that followed. She used race to frame an imaginary suspect, triggering fear and tension in her own community. She stood in front of cameras, holding on to a lie while rescue teams searched the very lake where she left her children. Her actions shaped new conversations about maternal filicide, mental health, and media manipulation. In prison, she has been disciplined several times for rule violations, but she has never shown remorse publicly in a way that satisfied the public. Many believe she should never be released. Family members of the boys, including their father, have made it clear they will fight any attempt at parole. Her story remains one of the most notorious child murder cases in American history, not because of mystery or confusion, but because of how calculated the cover-up was.